And you can go ahead, Terry.
Awesome. You going to be sharing your screen tonight? Yeah.
Yes, good catch. You do need something to present.
Well, while Sophie's pulling up her presentation, I will introduce myself. I'm Terry Harding. I forgot to rename myself, but my name is accurate. I just usually put City of Eugene and my pronouns are she, her. There we go. You can start the presentation. Perfect. Hopefully you all are seeing that. We're going to go over some group agreements and how we're going to run the meeting right after this. Where you made it. We're at the last information session before we head into the council process. So I just introduced myself. I'm the project manager for the city's middle housing code amendments, and I'll have Sophie and Jeff give a little introduction.
Hello, everyone. I am Sophie McGinley. I'm an associate planner with the City of Eugene's Community Planning and Design team, and I've served as public engagement lead for this project.
And I'm Jeff Gepper. I'm a senior planner on the land use planning team, and I'm here as the land use code person. I'll hand it back to Terry.
I have different hair from that picture that I had in the fall of COVID. So our agreements for this meeting are on the screen. Please keep yourself on mute until called upon. Put questions in the chat, and then staff, usually Jeff, will moderate those questions after we're done with the presentation. Please just one person speak at a time. Use respectful language and keep your question to 1 minute if you are unmuted. And then save your comments for the public hearing. We're in a space where we're sharing information that came out of the Planning Commission process. We are happy to answer questions, but comments should be directed to the City Council because they're the ones that will be making a decision, and we'll share with you how to do that. My part of the presentation is a little bit of background on House Bill 2001 and the city's middle housing code amendments, and then Sophie and Jeff each have a piece of the presentation after me. So the project is implementing House Bill 2001, which passed the state legislature in 2019. It eliminates single family only zoning. So in Eugene, that's our R1 zone. It doesn't eliminate the zone, but it eliminates the single family only nature of it. And that's true for large cities across Oregon. And large cities are those with 25,000 residents or more. The middle housing bill is sort of the nickname of this law, and it came with a deadline for implementation of June 30th of this year. And along with that, the state has developed a set of minimum standards and a model code, which we will go into a fair amount of detail about throughout the presentation. So what are we talking about when we talk about middle housing? This term was originally coined by Opticos Design out of California as missing middle housing, and it's everything between detached single-family houses and mid-rise apartment buildings. So here on the graphic, it's duplexes all the way up to live-work, and some pictures of what those buildings could look like. In Oregon, the middle housing bill defined middle housing a little bit more narrowly than the graphic we just showed you. So this is definitions from the House bill, which is now in Oregon administrative rules. A duplex, which is 2 units, a triplex, which is 3, a fourplex, which is 4, a cottage cluster, which is a grouping of no fewer than 4 small dwellings. They have a footprint of no greater than 900 square feet, and that they're around a common courtyard. And then the final type of middle housing is townhouses. 2 or more attached dwellings where they share at least one common wall, and each is located on its own lot or parcel. After the rule was passed, or the bill was passed, the state started the process of rulemaking. And this helps cities know how to comply with a bill. And it's done for a variety of different laws that are passed. So it was headed by the Department of Land Conservation and Development. They established a few committees. One was the Rules Advisory Committee, which was made up of members from all around the state from different backgrounds and expertise areas, and a technical advisory committee, or TAC, which helped work on the model code that we'll be talking about. So the results of that rulemaking process were a set of minimum standards, which outline the lowest bar that cities have to meet in order to comply with the legislation, and the model code, which is an example of how to meet those standards. So it is a kind of example which can be used directly, but will apply if the cities don't apply develop their own codes by the deadline for bill implementation. And again, we'll get into this a little bit more later in the presentation, what some of the differences are. Lastly, those documents were adopted by a commission, the state's Land Conservation and Development Commission. Thanks, Sophie. I missed that bullet until the very end there. So what does this mean for Eugene? Locally, we knew that we would need to comply with the House bill by the deadline. And we had a lot of housing work already going on in the city of Eugene. We had goals developed during the Envision Eugene process. We have climate action goals, we have transportation goals. And so for this project, we established these three as the goals for the project. First, comply with the House bill and have Eugene's local regulations survive appeals and implement the law at the local level. Secondly, further equity and long-term housing affordability. And thirdly, to enable housing availability and diversity. And these second two project goals are helped by the council's recent action on the Housing Implementation Pipeline project, which you can find online. Now I'm going to pass it over to Sophie to talk a little bit about the public involvement process.
Thank you, Terry. So the public involvement process kicked off with the adoption of the approval of the public involvement plan in summer of 2020. It included a lot of the usual things that we see in planning outreach, including some stakeholder groups and a big community-wide survey. And then we added some new things. So we had an equity roundtable and a lottery selected panel where participants were compensated. The lottery selected panel was representative of Eugene demographics, so kind of like Eugene in a room, and they met over the course of 6 months to deliberate their recommendations. We also partnered with the university for some student outreach. We had some interns put together a Gen Z GIS story map. We did a lot of social media. All of this was done throughout the pandemic, so it was virtual, and we tried to get creative. And then, of course, we've heard a lot of public testimony. The project has gone through the Planning Commission, who've made their recommendation, and we're on the way to City Council. And I could talk a lot more about the public engagement, so feel free to ask questions about that. I don't expect you to digest this entire graphic right now over Zoom, but it's available on the project webpage, which is eugene-or.gov/middle housing. So really what happened, or what the result was of the public engagement, the first phase of public engagement, was 3 ways that we could comply with the bill. So we came up with allow, encourage, and incentivize. One of the key guiding values and principles that resulted from our public engagement was to go beyond the minimum standards established by the bill. So allow is meet the minimum standards. Encourage is exceed the minimum standards in some cases to remove some barriers to middle housing. And incentivize is do even more to remove barriers to lower the cost of middle housing. So you'll hear these 3 words from us a lot, and they're available in our guide to the Planning Commission recommendation, where there's a code summary that is labeled with allow, encourage, incentivize. It also provides an overview of the minimum standards and the model code for each housing type. If that's too much and you want to look at some background information, the first page is just a list of hyperlinks to a bunch of background information that you can dive into. And we have some high-level fact sheets. We have some really detailed code memos. So highly recommend looking at this guide. And again, that's available on the project webpage. And I'll go a little bit into how to read the code summary tables. So as I said, there's an overview of the minimum standards. So the far left column in these summary tables are the minimum standards. And this is the allow. This is what we must do to comply with House Bill 2001. The middle column is the model code. And so the model code is an example of how to meet the minimum standards. Cities were able to choose to directly adopt the model code if they wished. If cities, including Eugene, do not comply with House Bill 2001 by the deadline of June 30th, 2022, then the model code will automatically apply. And even though it meets the minimum standards, in some cases it exceeds and differs from the minimum standards. Then on the far right is the Planning Commission's recommended code. And this is just for R1. So just wanted to have that disclaimer. And then it's labeled with allow, encourage, and incentivize. So generally, a lot of the proposed code, or the Planning Commission's proposed code, meets allow. So that includes frontage, lot width, setbacks, parking, and design standards. A little bit of it is encourage, and we'll go into that a bit. And then there's three main incentives, which I'll go into more detail. One of the highlights of the Planning Commission recommendation is encouraging with building height. And so currently the maximum building height in the R1 zone is 30 feet. And for duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and townhouses, it's proposed to be 35 feet to allow the building of a third story. So we wanted to talk a little bit about building height because we've been hearing a lot of questions about it. And we've heard numbers like 30, 35, 37, and 42. So let's do a poll. Let's take this house. If the maximum height for this house is 35 feet, what would that point be? And let me see if I can figure out how to activate this poll while I'm sharing my screen. So we'll launch the height poll. You should see that pop up now. And I'll just repeat the question. If the maximum height for this house is 35 feet, where would that point be? And the options are point A or point B. And you can drag the poll box around if it's blocking your view. Okay, I'll give it just a few more seconds before I share the results. All right, you should be able to see now we have a mix of answers. Most people say point A. So actually, if the maximum building height is 35 feet, that point would be measured at point B. But even if the maximum height is proposed to be 35 feet for middle housing, an additional 7 feet of building height is allowed for roof slopes of 6/12 or steeper. This is not a new standard and currently applies to housing in our residential zones with some exceptions. This means that the current maximum building height of 30 feet in the R1 zone, a single family home, for example, may reach 37 feet at the peak of the roof if that roof has a slope of 6/12. This would also mean that if the maximum building height for middle housing is 35 feet, the building height may reach 42 feet at the peak of the roof if that roof has a slope of 6/12. And we love engagement, so we have another poll for you. Let me launch that one. So this is a maximum build out scenario that our urban designer Jen put together. And the question is, which of these houses are fourplexes? And there's a bit of a hint in there because houses is plural. And you can choose multiple answers. So I have that launched. I'll let you think about it. Which of these houses are fourplexes? I should have brought back the jazz for the polls. Next time I'll have Jeopardy music. Okay, we had only one answer for a little bit, so I'm letting it come in. Awesome, those are just sliding in. I'll end the poll and share the results. So it looks like people are pretty sure B is a fourplex, and then it looks like A and D are tied, and not very many people think C. So let's see which houses are fourplexes. So they would be B and D. B is the max build out with using parking reduction incentives. And D is the maximum build out with maximum parking required. And this is the back. So this just shows that, again, D is the maximum build out of a fourplex under the proposed code standards with maximum parking. B is the maximum build out without proposed without maximum parking. And then I forgot to mention A is the current maximum build out of a single family home right now in R1. And C is a more modest rendering of an R1 home. So you can see the difference between A, which is that max build out of a single family home under current standards, B, the fourplex, C, another single family home, and D, a fourplex. And this really shows the impact of parking requirements on space and the impact of the increased lot coverage or proposed increased lot coverage. Okay, so now let's talk about going beyond the minimum standards. So much of the proposed code does meet the minimum standards, but where it differs, it does so to incentivize smaller housing types, lower cost housing, income qualified housing, transit-oriented development, and flexibility for already developed sites. And this was really how I think what the intention of the minimum standards were, is that they would act as a minimum and each city would comply in a way that makes sense for them. And so we are not alone in proposing to differ from the minimum standards. We are joined by Albany, Bend, Gresham, Milwaukee, Newburgh, Portland, Salem, and Springfield. And this will be, we expect this to be, as all infill is, slow and incremental change. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the incentives. So we mentioned those already a little bit, but I have details and some pictures. So those are detached units, smaller housing, housing near transit, and affordable housing. So up first is detached units. And so the minimum standards allow cities to choose between, or to choose whether middle housing is attached or detached. I think usually when we think of middle housing, or if we think of a duplex, we think of one big building. And so the allow option is just to allow attached units, but there's that choice to allow detached units that cities can make. So that's in our proposal. And this is something that is not new. There's actually an example here on the screen of a detached fourplex in Eugene. It's on Patterson Alley. So you can see here from the front what it looks like. And then there's 4 units. And we're hoping that this allows some backyard infill that will discourage displacing existing houses. Here's another example in the Washburn district in downtown Springfield. This was actually permitted as a single family house with an attached accessory dwelling unit and detached accessory dwelling unit, but this could be an example of a detached triplex. Another incentive is for smaller housing. And so for each middle housing unit that is 900 square feet or smaller, there's a parking minimum reduction. Sorry that slipped my mind for a moment. And then there's also a lot size reduction. And so this is intended to encourage the development of smaller units on smaller lots that decrease the cost of new development. That would So if we allow that lot size reduction, that would hopefully decrease the cost of land, and then smaller units would hopefully decrease the cost of the unit. And this is a great graphic that we borrowed from our friends at Better Housing Together, that was modified from a graphic we made that just shows that currently we're seeing that new housing being delivered at 200% of area median income. So this is your typical new build of single family homes. And our consultants, Eco Northwest, project that the construction of new middle housing will hit between 71% and 94% of area median income. So while this is not capital A subsidized affordable housing, it is market rate housing that truly will be offered at a rate that currently we are not seeing in our local market. And we're hoping that to decrease the costs even more by incentivizing those smaller units. Another incentive is housing near transit. And so this would provide flexibility and align with transit-oriented development and goals to reduce dependence on single occupancy vehicles. And that incentive is a reduction in on-site parking requirements within a quarter mile of frequent transit, and then a half mile of MX corridors. And the last incentive that I have for you all is for affordable housing or fixed income housing. And so this is an on-site parking reduction and a lot size reduction if at least half of the units in middle housing are available at 80% of area median income or below. This is a graphic that I pulled from the housing implementation pipeline that Terry referenced earlier. That's available at eugene-or.gov/HIP or HIP. And this is something we really want to hear feedback on through the adoption process. Is 80% of area median income the right level, the right amount? And I've been talking for way too long, and so I will pass it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Sophie. So I'm going to talk about a few hot topics, and these are just generally things that we're hearing or getting a lot of questions about. And so those will be special area zones, or what we call SAZs, historic districts, covenants, conditions, and restrictions, commonly referred to as CC&Rs, and then middle housing land divisions. So I'm going to jump in with SAZs first. And so special area zones, these are essentially, there are certain parts of town that have a special set of standards applied to them, and it's applied through what we call a special area zone. And that special area zone is essentially has a boundary that applies to it, and it has standards that might differ from traditional residential areas or commercial areas or whatever area it applies to. So when our planning commission was looking at the input from public testimony and our engagement platforms and all the really good work that Terry and Sophie and our team put into this project, they found that the best thing to do is actually just to treat middle housing on an equitable basis and just say, you know what, all the rules for middle housing are just going to be same across the city. We're not going to have special standards in certain special area zones apply. We just want it to be clear, concise, and easy for people trying to develop middle housing. So those rules will just always be the same. And so that's an important thing that our planning commission stood up for, was just to make sure that our city, everybody in our city for residential areas is treated the same. That said, our historic districts, we do have a couple of historic districts. We've got special historic zone, which is a certain type of special area zone. And then we have some specific areas like the Blair historic area or the East Spencer Butte area. And the state law actually carved out a special exception for these parts of town. So when you have actually like a historic designation or protections that are based on a historic presence, those special historic standards can still apply. So, and there's in those few areas in our town where we do have historic districts, the special standards for historic districts will apply, as well as the middle housing standards. So those are one of the few exceptions. And so looking at CC&Rs, and so CC&Rs are an interesting thing because they're actually something that's recorded along with the property. So the city isn't the one to actually enforce these. These are, you'll commonly see these as part of your homeowners association or HOA. They'll say things like, there's an architectural committee, or you can only paint your house blue, or something of that nature. There are certain CC&Rs though that might say you can only have one house on this lot. And if a CC&R is that explicit, it is essentially prohibiting middle housing. You wouldn't be able to develop middle housing on a lot that has a CC&R that says you can only have one house here. If that CC&R existed before the state law was adopted in 2019, then that CC&R can be upheld, and it can be used to prohibit and limit that lot to only have one house on it. That said, any CC&Rs that are recorded after the state law was adopted in 2019, you cannot limit them in that way. So if you went out today and you recorded a CC&R that said, my lot can only ever be developed with a single family home, you would not actually be able to enforce that under state law. And so that's just a clarification that if you do have CC&Rs on your property, you might want to go find out what those are, and just remember that the city doesn't have a database of those. That's something that you would talk to a title company about, because they're recorded against the properties themselves and not monitored by the city. And so finally, middle housing land divisions. So this is one of the more nuanced topics. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time here because it is really important. So when you think of land division, people typically think of what we would call a partition or a subdivision. Most people use the word subdivision. It's literally like you have a piece of land, you want to chop it up into pieces, sell those pieces off to other people to develop houses on them. Middle housing land divisions are a little bit different, and they were actually instigated by the state. Senate Bill 458 was brought on after HB 2001 was implemented, because HB 2001 was really put in place to effectively create more housing options. The goal was to increase, the availability of middle housing, which traditionally wasn't being built. So it's often referred to as missing middle housing. And they said, okay, great, we're creating different housing options through HB 2001, but what about home ownership? And that's where middle housing land divisions come in. And that's why the state also passed these rules. And so what we really did was we just kind of took the state's guidance on middle housing land divisions and we're implementing them through this process. And it creates ways to own an individual piece of middle housing. So one piece in a triplex or one cottage within a cottage cluster, without having to go through a condominiumization process. So condominiums or condos are what you would typically see when people are trying to just buy one unit out of a greater whole. The thing is that going through the condo process is really expensive, and you typically don't own the land underneath your house. You own your house and the walls and from kind of the paint within. Under the middle housing land divisions, it's providing you an opportunity to not only own your house, but own the land under it. And really that's the whole reason why middle housing land divisions were created. So it's a whole new process. And conceptually, what you can think of it as is you have a parent lot, and on that parent lot, you develop a fourplex. Within that parent lot, each unit within the fourplex can be put on what you'd refer to as a child lot. And that child lot is able to be sold off individually from the rest of those to a new home buyer of any type. And that one little unit it's not just a rental, it can be sold, but it remains one piece of a greater whole. It's always one piece of that bigger fourplex development. So it's never its own single family home. It's just one unit in a fourplex. And so Sophie, if you jump to the next slide, I've got some examples here at the bottom. So at the bottom of the screen, you see two examples. One is a duplex, that's on the left, and one on the right is a cottage cluster. These are both examples existing in Eugene, so they don't necessarily meet the new middle housing code, but just using them as examples here today. And on the left, so the purple box is really showing, that's the outer box, is showing the parent lot. So within that parent lot, your development, whatever it is, a duplex, triplex, fourplex, whatever, is going to have to meet all the normal requirements. You have to meet setbacks, you have to meet lot coverage, you have to meet building height. All those development standards still apply within that parent lot. And then once you do, if you want to do a middle housing land division, you essentially get to draw a box in whatever shape you want, as long as it contains one unit of middle housing. And so the one on the right is a really good example of this, where the purple box is really big, but you see the red boxes are really small. So they sold off each unit. They drew a box really carefully around that, or I did that in PowerPoint, but the rest of the area is owned kind of as a bigger whole. So that's all covered by easements or a common agreement as to how that area is managed. And so on the screen right now, what you see are some of the basic rules. So that's the other thing. Middle housing land divisions are much simpler than our traditional subdivision processes. So the rules are effectively, you can only have one unit per child lot. Each lot or unit must have separate utilities. You have to have all the necessary easements for things like utilities, parking areas, sidewalks, etc. You have to meet the building code, and then you have to meet, like I said, on that parent lot, all the other development standards that normally apply. And this process isn't without public engagement. So there's still a required notice that goes out with this, just like a traditional partition and subdivision. So there is still a process involved and an opportunity for people to weigh in. That said, as I said earlier, this isn't granting anybody additional development rights. You can build that fourplex. This is just allowing somebody to divide it so they can sold, those units could be sold off individually. And so that's middle housing land divisions. And so really the one thing that Sophie mentioned it earlier, as did Terry, we've got our website, Eugene-or.gov/middle housing. It has more information than a lot of people will know what to do with. I really recommend going to this webpage. You can watch any of the videos from our previous meetings, from some of the committees, just about anything you want is on there. But the thing that I really point people to is that guide to the Planning Commission recommendation. Sophie mentioned it earlier, but the guide really does a good job of introducing you to what HB 2001 is, what the Middle Housing Code amendments are about, and then where we're at in the process, gives you that history and context, and then it dives into what the new rules are and what's being proposed for the city of Eugene. And so again, I just can't recommend enough going and checking out the guide. As well as some of the FAQs. Actually, I still go back to the FAQs occasionally to double check whether I got something correct. So where are we in this process and kind of what's next? So this is our last information session that we're doing for this one. So we are still receiving and have been receiving written testimony, and all this written testimony is going to be provided to the decision makers. In this case, the decision makers are the city council. So the city council will hold a public hearing on April 18th. That's when they're scheduled for at this time. And at that public hearing, you can come and provide verbal testimony. I will say that verbal testimony is typically limited to a few minutes. So if you have substantial comments, I highly recommend you submit those in writing so that the city council can consider that in full, as opposed to just a little 3-minute chunk. So following the city council public hearing, the city council will have some meetings to deliberate the proposal, discuss what's on the table, and then eventually the city council will take action. And the plan is to have that action happen prior to June 30th, 2022, because as Terry mentioned at the very beginning, if we don't adopt a local code by July 1st, the state's model code will apply. And we really believe that a city-specific local code is really important. So again, like I said, we're receiving written testimony, so you can do that by sending, and whatever you do, if you send me an email, if you send Sophie an email, if you send the city council an email, please always CC middle housing testimony at eugene-or.gov. That's our kind of repository for testimony. If you send it to that email address, you will be 100,000% sure that it will be included in our record. So always send it to that, even if you're sending it to somebody else. And then you have the opportunity to provide your verbal testimony on April 18th. So finally, again, can't reiterate enough, the guide, go look at the guide, go look at the guide. The project page seriously has there's some really good graphics on there too. If some of the concepts like detached plexes or what can a max build out scenario look like? Those are on the webpage, so it's really helpful to go there and just kind of peruse, as well as some of the history of zoning in Eugene. The other thing you can do on that website is sign up for the email list. So we have a list that we will send out people information on a regular basis. You can sign up to be an interested party there. And then finally, if you do have any other questions of any kind around middle housing, you can reach out to Sophie. So her email address is on the screen. It's smcginley@eugene-or.gov. I think with that, we are going to move on to the question and answer phase. And I will just say we did have one question in the chat earlier, right at the beginning, and that was related to building height. And Peter asked the question of, we mentioned before that you get an additional 7 feet of height if your roof pitch is 6/12. And he asked, that's 6/12 or steeper. And that's correct. Yeah, as long as your roof is 6/12 or steeper, you can take advantage of that additional 7 feet. You don't have to go to 7 feet. You can just have an additional foot if you want it. It's just allowing that flexibility. And so Peter does have another question here. He says, do the children need to have individual utility connections to the mains in the street? Or could there be shared utility feed onto the parent lot to which the children could then connect? So thank you for that question, Peter. That's a really good one. I'm going to take it because I've been talking about this a lot lately with our development liaison, Allie Camp, because she's been reaching out to eWeb, because obviously we only have control over one of the primary utilities, which would be wastewater. So for the wastewater, we do understand, it's my understanding, and I'm trying to get clarification on this. I'll probably create an FAQ around middle housing land division, or at least about the utility connection pieces. This was literally, I had a meeting about it today. We do believe that you can have a shared sewer connection, as far as but then you do have to have individual stubs that obviously go to each unit of middle housing. The water and electric, I will have to provide additional information on that on our project website, because I do not control. From the definition of the code, each unit does have to have its own separate water meter and electric meter, but whether or not that can be brought in through a common line to the site and then divided at that point, I do not know the answer. I do not have an active answer from eWeb at this time. So that's a great question. And so look on our project website for more information on that. Ken Doxy, hi. So you just tossed in a couple of statements there, and I'll just add, so if you want to ask, I see kind of 3 big topics. If you want to start with one question, we'll be happy to answer that. So if you want to unmute and ask a question, that'd be fine.
Well, I was scribbling ineffectively, and my name, by the way, is Ellen Wojan. My husband is Ken Doxy, and I'm using his computer. I was asking about the impact on solar with these kinds of building heights and the impact with the lot coverage on street parking to begin with.
Great. Thank you. I've talked a lot in the last 20 minutes. Do either of you want to take the solar question to start?
I can take a stab at it, and feel free to jump in if you'd like. So there's a thing in our code called solar setbacks. They apply to north-south lots, and they currently apply to in the R1 zone, and they would continue to apply in the R1 zone. So middle housing would be treated just the same as single family homes are right now with those solar setback standards for north-south lots. And there's some extra criteria aside from them being north-south lots. And if you want to get very technical, Jeff can do that.
Yeah, the main takeaway is really that we are not amending the applicability or the standards that exist for the existing solar standards that have been in our code for quite a long time. So those are not changing. And then I'm sorry, if you could reiterate your second part of that question, I'd really appreciate it.
I'm just wondering, street parking impacts, if you're going to reduce parking and increase lot coverage, seems to me you're forcing an awful lot of cars into car storage on the street.
Sophie or Terry, do you want to take that, or I can?
Yeah, I can start and then again jump in. Parking is a big area that was discussed throughout the public outreach process and the planning commission process, as you might expect. We also learned from our economic consultants at Echo Northwest that our areas where we can affect the feasibility of middle housing are pretty limited within the land use code. And so they looked at a variety of different things that we could do to encourage, as we were trying to do, to respond to the public outreach results. And really what they came up with was lot size, parking, building height and coverage. So the areas that are recommended to differ from the minimum standards is because those were found to be have an impact through the land use code. So it's a policy choice though, and it's a trade-off. So as the modeling images that Sophie showed earlier make clear, when you require parking, the building gets smaller. And so it's a trade-off. And when you don't require parking, it could still be built. And we're seeing that in places that already have adopted middle housing code. They're continuing to build parking. Lenders often require it. But from a policy perspective, it's one thing we can do to shift closer to our climate and transportation goals of reducing our use of single occupant vehicles and building more compact, walkable cities. It's definitely a policy choice and a trade-off. So I think that the planning commission, heard a lot of comments about parking and what to do, and the council will hear that as well.
I have a little bit to add on, Terry. I'll reiterate that removing a parking minimum does not prohibit someone from building parking. You know, often, as Terry said, the market regulates that and parking will still be built. And then I also wanted to add that for streets that do not meet our urbanization standards, so streets that, you know, such as unannexed streets in the River Road area, they would not be eligible for those on-street parking credits because there is substandard parking. So part of the incentive is on-street parking credits and would not be applicable there. And if you have anything to add to that, Jeff, go for it.
I would just mention that anybody that's interested, especially in parking, or I know oftentimes in these meetings we hear about electric vehicles and the like. This code does not contemplate this process does not contemplate electric vehicles. It does contemplate parking, but I highly recommend checking out the climate friendly and equitable communities rulemaking that's currently happening at the state level at this point. That is going to be much more focused on the issues of parking and our climate future. So definitely take a look at that if that's something that interests you. I think that's something that's going to have a just as big of an impact on parking, if not more. So with that, I'm going to move on to Karen Murphy's question, which is, just to be clear on height, the maximum building height would be 42 feet. And so I'll say that the maximum building height, as it will identify itself in the code, and thank you, Sophie just put a link to the climate friendly and equitable communities in the chat. In the code, the maximum building height for middle housing as it's drafted says 35 feet. That additional 7 feet is an existing code provision that's already there. And so yes, you could build up to 42 feet. The idea around that extra 7 feet is that, unlike if you had a flat roof where you just have walls that go all the way up 42 feet high, that's not what's going to happen. You'll have 35 feet and then a pitched roof. So one point could be 42 feet, but you have to have that. That's the reason the roof is pitched, so that it doesn't, you know, that's not 42 feet of just like sun blocking building, you know, it's pitched. That's the idea there. So I hope I made that clear with my fun arm gestures. Julie Hume asks, is the Willamette River Greenway considered a special area zone? What protections will be in place for the Willamette River Greenway? So I just got done making fun arm gestures about building height pitch. Sophie, do you want to talk a little bit about the Willamette River Greenway code amendments, which are a separate process, but kind of simultaneously happening with the middle housing code amendments?
Yes, so because we heard feedback from our outreach groups, and Jeff, if you could grab the link to the code amendments webpage for more information about the Willamette Greenway code amendments, that would be great. But because we heard outreach to treat all areas of the city the same, it seemed like a good time to propose to amend the Willamette Greenway code to allow the building of middle housing and to allow a clear and objective path for housing being built in the Greenway. This includes the establishment of a setback in the Greenway. And there is a ton more information about this. There's actually, if you love information sessions like this one, we did one for the Willamette Greenway code amendments, and that video is available on the land use code amendments webpage, which Jeff just put in the chat. So really the short answer is it's not a special area zone, but it is being proposed, it is treated differently than the rest of the city for specific reasons. And we are proposing to allow middle housing in it that would be subject to clear and objective standards. And there is definitely opportunity for you to weigh in on that, but I encourage going to that webpage. I encourage you to watch the staff presentation, and then I encourage you to write in testimony with what you think.
Yeah, and I'll just tack onto that just to make sure that there's a clear understanding that the Willamette River Greenway boundary is not proposed to change. Within that boundary, that's where you have to essentially, there's an additional set of standards that is applied to any new development that occurs there. And what this process, just to simplify that, it's setting out a new clear and objective process that still involves public engagement, it involves notice, it involves a potential appeal and everything else. But it sets out specific standards that are clear and objective for housing within the Greenway. And so, sorry, I just laughing at Peter's comment. Looking down the list, and I don't actually see any additional questions in the chat at this time. So if you have anything that's kind of coming up as the middle housing concepts are rolling around in your brain, we're happy to answer anything on your plate. But as a reminder, we've done a number of these info sessions. There were some earlier on. Obviously, you can also go back and watch the Planning Commission's final recommendation that was on January 25th if you want to take a look at that. The Planning Commission also wrote a really meaningful letter around their recommendation, which is a really good read for those that are interested to see kind of the intent and thoughts of our Planning Commission. So they worked really, really hard on this process, and I really respect them for it.
I do have a couple more questions. I'm wondering if I'm correct that it is the newer subdivisions that tend to have CC&Rs as opposed to our older neighborhoods.
Actually, I would say that, so the CC&Rs go way back. A lot of subdivisions had CC&Rs. A lot of the older ones from like the 30s and 40s and 50s, those CC&Rs are often lost to time or potentially problematic in a lot of ways, and so they aren't often implemented. Those CC&Rs that were brought forward in the more common period of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, those are much easily more found, but I would say there's not really a difference in the number of CC&Rs that are being enacted at this time.
I would just add on to that. Part of House Bill 2001, as Jeff mentioned earlier, prohibited any CC&Rs from prohibiting middle housing after the adoption of the bill. So the newest subdivisions built after July of 2019 cannot have that in their CC&Rs.
My concern was that the impact would be heavier on our older neighborhoods.
Yeah, and if I'm honest, generally speaking, the CCNRs, you don't see many CCNRs that say like this lot shall only ever be developed with one single house. It's more often more related to design or caretaking features than it is those types of limitations. That said, those limitations do exist in some places.
My other concerns are about impacts on tree cover and green space with lot coverage again. And whether or not we can do anything to ensure that what's built is actually affordable.
Mhm.
Great.
Those are two really good things to talk through. I'll take the first one on trees, or maybe you should take that one, Jeff. It's more, you're a land use code expert.
Sure. So we are essentially proposing that middle housing is treated the same way that we treat our single family homes and duplexes. They currently have tree preservation standards that apply only to them, which allows a certain number of trees to be cut down on a property when a property is going to be developed. That said, those changes are in Chapter 9. There are also tree preservation standards that exist in Chapter 6 of our code. And the Chapter 6 tree preservation standards are not being changed, so those will still apply to new developments. That said, there are certain parts of our code that we're pretty intentional about, and one of those is actually, we discussed it a little bit earlier, which would be things like parking reductions on site. So when you require a parking space on a site, oftentimes, if you are going to take advantage of putting as much building on your property as possible, if you're also required to put a parking space can be located in a setback. So if you have a tree in a setback or something like that, that's when that tree starts getting taken out. And so that's one of those areas where that flexibility that's being proposed by reduced parking spaces, allowing the detached plexes. So if you allow a detached plex, you could locate one building over here and one building over here and have the tree gets to stay in the middle. Those types of design flexibility options that we're trying to build into this code is really where you'll see that benefit to our tree cover. So that's kind of where I'll stop with that one. And Terry, I'll turn it over to you for the discussion on affordability.
Yeah. So again, another topic that we know is very important to folks, including everyone who has commented and the whole planning commission. The first thing to know, we do have an FAQ specifically about affordability and middle housing on the website, so you can check that out. The first FAQ on that sheet is that the law itself does not allow the city to require new middle housing to be affordable. So that just from the get-go, we're not allowed to do that because it's not a requirement that is put on single family detached housing. And the overall goal of the House bill is to put middle housing on a level playing field with single family detached. And so the affordability requirement cannot be put in place. However, we can do things within the code, and we asked the economic consultants what we could do to encourage affordability. And they came up with a few ideas, including the reduced lot sizes, reducing the requirements for parking, and the list of incentives that Sophie went over earlier. So the last thing I'll say, because we could talk about this for an hour, and I'm happy to actually, because I think it's really important, is that the affordability incentives, which are for income qualified housing, are not a part of the model code. They're something that was developed by Eugene and is recommended to be included by our planning commission's version of the code. If we have the model code, it won't have any of those. So I think that's one of the key differences folks should think about if they're advocating for affordable housing. Okay.
All right, so we got another question in the chat from Julie that says, Eugene's current goal to increase tree canopy and new middle housing development appear to be in opposition. Can you talk about this or address this? Sorry, it's in the paraphrase. So either you want to take that one or you want me to jump onto it? So I'll take it.
Go for it, Jeff.
So I think the first thing I'll say here is that, yeah, there's definitely some parts of this, the middle housing development proposal or the middle housing code amendments, geez, that do present challenges in terms of tough policy choices. And that's one of the things that our policymakers are really going to have to grapple with, is the fact that, yeah, we are trying to increase our tree canopy, but we're also trying to develop at the scale that and provide a level of housing that our city requires. And so by allowing new middle housing, we're not necessarily talking about a lot like decreasing our tree canopy. It's entirely possible that by allowing new middle housing, you might get people planting more trees or developing lots that are currently have no trees on them and putting trees on them. The allowance of middle housing isn't a direct correlation to the removal of trees. So what I would really say is that, we have to implement this House bill, and we need to provide more housing opportunities that is consistent with the intent of HB 2001. And there's definitely some push and pull with that. And so that's a decision that really is going to come down to the policymakers. But I think as proposed, we really aren't making that substantial of a change in regards to our tree preservation standards that already exist in the way that they're applied. And so, yeah, Sophie, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it bears repeating that, we're hoping that the increased flexibility that comes with allowing detached middle housing could preserve existing trees that are sitting in the middle of lots right now. And, we cannot treat middle housing differently than single family homes in the same zone regarding tree preservation standards. And so I also think, it's a good time to look at those tree preservation standards for R1 in general. And so if you have thoughts about that, you can certainly share those with council, because we are limited to what we apply to single family homes. But again, I'll repeat it for the third time. The flexibility with detached units could accommodate existing sites, and proposed tree preservation standards are not proposed, or existing tree preservation standards in Chapter 6 are not proposed to change.
Thanks. Yeah, those are great reminders.
We budgeted 30 more minutes for this. We don't have to be on here for 30 more minutes. We're happy to be on here for as long as it takes to answer your questions. Just make sure that everyone has their questions answered before the public hearing. If something comes up, if you go through our webpage and our documents and the guide to the Planning Commission recommendation and a question comes up for you, please feel free to email me. I can put my email in the chat. If I'm not the right person, I know the right person to forward it to. We just are here for you to answer your questions, and we want to hear from you before the public hearing and at the public hearing.
Could I just ask a question?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so I originally grew up in Denver many years ago, and there was a neighborhood there that was a lot of small homes, good sized lots. And now that whole area has turned into duplexes and row houses that are probably, each unit individually is probably 6,000 square feet. And they're $1 million homes or more. So I look at it and I think, well, that you got rid of affordable housing for, smaller mansions. So how do you think there's a chance that this could happen under this proposal as well in certain areas? Maybe not quite like that, but.
That's a great question. I think we will do our best to summarize what the economic feasibility consultants found, because this was one of the questions we initially asked them, was which parts of Eugene have the market conditions and are most likely to see development happen if we were to change the code tomorrow and allow middle housing everywhere. Where would that development pressure be felt the most? And they did that. Thank you, Sophie, you're so fast. She linked to the feasibility memo in the chat. It's not that long. It's like a 6-page memo, if I remember correctly. And then it has some maps. And so a super high level summary of that is that the projected rate and distribution of new middle housing is anticipated to follow existing development trends within the city of Eugene. And so where you see a lot of student housing near the university, that's projected to continue with more opportunities for different types of housing. Where you see mostly single large lot housing, that's actually the most feasible thing to build in certain parts of the city, and that is projected to continue. And on one of Sophie's slides, she had the bullet that overall infill is anticipated to be incremental and slow. And there are a fair number of folks commenting on this proposal that are worried that this won't do anything. So I think there's a broad range of public comment coming in, a lot of fear about how fast and where big buildings could be built, and also fear that just changing the code, it's only one piece of the puzzle. And we talked about the housing implementation pipeline and other work the city is doing for housing, for subsidized affordable housing. Those are other parts of the puzzle that the city is intending to take action on. But this project has to do with updating the zoning to allow the types of housing in the different zones. So it's a big question. I think we could go a lot of different angles with it, Karen, but it's spot on. We're hearing a lot of commentary about those kinds of scenarios.
And just to add on to that, Terry, the middle housing code amendments will give folks to the ability to choose to build middle housing. It does not require that they build middle housing. And so something that feasibility memo showed was that really we're still going to see a lot of construction, or we anticipate seeing a lot of construction of single family homes, because they have their place in the market. They have their demand. So there's kind of this like running joke we have that like we keep talking about June 30th, 2022, but July 1st, 2023, like not like it's going to be the same. It's really like we're going to be waiting and waiting and waiting. And then just the options of what you can choose to build will expand. So we do expect this to be incremental change. And we do still just expect to see a lot of the same development that we have been seeing continue being built.
Yeah, like we said, we could talk about this all night. So I think Sophie and Terry have answered it really well, and I'm just gonna leave it there at this point and answer this next question, or put this next question. Which Sue asked, can affordability, boy, it's 8 o'clock. Can affordability be required to build middle housing that takes advantage of the parts of the proposed code amendments that go beyond the state's model code? That makes sense when I read it out.
I think what you're asking, Sue, is can development be required, or developers be required to build middle housing? Or are you asking if the incentives can only be offered to affordable housing? That might be
that was my interpretation.
Summarizing it. Feel free to unmute, Sue, or I'll try to answer it if that's what you meant. The short answer is yes. There's a pretty broad range of what the council can do. They could direct us to just use the state's model code. And there are parts of it that are more lenient and more permissive than the minimum standards, but that is a choice that the council could do. And they could also change how the incentives apply. So I think that's the short answer. And if you have any more kind of follow-up, I'd be happy to talk more.
I'm going to throw another link into the chat. I love the links, but our consultants did another memo exploring the impacts of the different code scenarios: allow, encourage, incentivize. Affordable housing is very important. Subsidized housing is very important. But then something else we're looking at is market rate housing that's not being built right now. So right now, as that graph showed, new market rate housing is coming in at or above 200% of area median income. And then there's this huge gap between 80% area median income and 200%, where we're not seeing new construction come. So what this memo showed was that when we encourage and incentivize smaller units, we tend to see lower cost units come in below area median income. I believe it came down to 70%, 71% of area median income. So although that is not subsidized capital A affordable housing, it's housing that our community needs that we're just not currently seeing. So highly recommend looking at that memo.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, the difference between subsidized affordable housing and lowercase just affordable lower cost housing is really important, and we're trying to get both of those. I mean, that's why you do see we built in those incentives for true subsidized housing, so those can be applied in that way.
And just one more plug for the housing implementation pipeline that is going to continue work on subsidized affordable housing and fixed income housing. And that can be seen at eugene-or.gov/HIP.
Let's see that link, Sophie. Put it in the chat.
I will put the link in there.
I would add another comment to the work that's being contemplated through the HIP, and that is there's another House bill that passed at the same time as House Bill 2001, and it was 2003, and it has to do with housing production strategies. That's its nickname. And so that one has more specific requirements for production in terms of like building housing and subsidized housing in particular. And the city is on a timeline of complying with that House bill by, I think it's 2026. I know it's after House Bill 2001, but they were companion bills that went together. Whereas House Bill 2001 focuses on the zoning code and what types of housing need to be allowed in the different zones. 2003 focuses more on affordability and production of housing out of the ground.
May I make a comment and see if anyone has anything to add?
Please.
Give it a shot.
Okay. I think any city's fate with development is closely related to the quality of its developers. And I would say that Eugene has not enjoyed a surplus of quality developers over decades. And so when I see something like this is one of my fears, is that we will get not the creative development that we're all hoping for and imagining, but boxes. And because the affordability and the housing availability crisis is so extreme, it will get sucked up. People will need it and use it, but it will contribute to a decline in the built environment.
Can I jump in here on that?
Actually, Peter, I might just step in.
Okay, go ahead.
Before we do that, one thing I would say is that one, obviously design is an eye of the beholder, but two, there's nothing stopping people from designing what people may perceived as boxes that are single family homes. It's very difficult to regulate design in a way that will produce desired outcomes that people want, because everybody wants different things. And so the key here is to providing flexibility allows for the various types of developments to occur throughout town. You know, the more design features that you require or add to a development, the higher cost that is. So therefore you're impacting affordability. There's just a myriad of problems when you try to get into that level of regulation. And really the important factor here is we have a state mandate that's requiring us to allow and provide opportunities for more housing types in Eugene. And we're doing that in a way that's providing flexibility so that we can see that in different ways, depending on lot configuration, price range, intended development styles. And so I really think that that's the right mix of regulation versus flexibility. I think we're really trying to strike that balance, and that the proposal that the Planning Commission has put forward, I really think hits that. Sophie, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, so there are actually some design standards included in the proposed code. They were established by the minimum standards in the model code. So the minimum standards defer to the model code. They say that design standards must be, one, the same design standards applicable to single detached dwellings or single family homes in the same zone, or two, the design standards directly from the model code, or three, design standards that are less restrictive than the design standards in the model code. So we have no design standards applicable to single family homes currently. So similar to tree preservation, if you do not think that design standards for single family homes in R1 are adequate, or if you would like to see those, you can certainly voice that to City Council, because that's the bar for we cannot apply anything to middle housing, any design standards to middle housing that are not applicable to single family dwellings in the same zone. But the proposed code actually doesn't do that. It does propose the design standards included in the model code. And so those include standards for entry orientation, windows, garages and off-street parking areas, and driveway approaches. And so that is actually one case where there are stricter standards on middle housing than on single detached dwellings or single family homes. And if you want, I can post in a link to the model code if you would like to see exactly what those are. But I'll stop talking. I could ramble about that. But we have design standards, and we decided to, or the Planning Commission decided to go with the ones in the model code instead of going with none at all, which apply to single family homes.
Well said.
Can
Okay.
I just interject? So we did have a Better Housing Together, and the city sponsored an event last week from the Incremental Housing Development Network, right, who's going to be having workshops. And what I gleaned from that made a lot of sense is we're going to see a whole new type of developer doing this. The developers you see and whose work you see are large-scale developers who buy relatively large plots and develop a lot of housing. This is going to be necessarily at a different infill scale. And it's a hard type of development to do if you are someone oriented towards massive production. So for example, I mean, I taught housing at the University of Oregon for 30 years. I was on the technical advisory committee for the DLCD. And when this goes forward, we're planning on taking our backyard and putting 3 units in it, right? And we've got frontage on 2 streets. And it's important to have the detached unit rule that the city is going towards, because we're going to build them around the existing large oak trees in the backyard. So I think what you're seeing is that this might allow for a type of developer and a type of approach to development that's really different from what has been possible in the past. And you know, a good example recently is one of my former students, Dylan Lamar, just built the C Street co-ops in Springfield last year. And it's a beautiful little development with 6 small units on a residential lot that fits into the neighborhood so well. And those are the kind of developers I see popping up. And I know a number of people who want to do this type of development, who want to do those kind of quality projects. So I think it might lead to a better type of development than we're used to seeing previously.
Points all very well taken. My concern has been what's happened with infill on, West Side neighborhood, things like that. That to me is heavily boxes. And I hope you're right that we get a lot of creativity, because that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I think one of my big hopes is with the detached plexus opportunity that we don't see that it will discourage that tear down of existing homes and just allow that flexibility to develop those lots that do have the space to do so. Because the previous code requiring something to be attached, it's very unlikely that somebody will engineer an attached structure. In that case, it makes a lot more sense to tear down a house and do that. So I think that piece of flexibility is really important.
And we've gone on about this for a while, and we can go for longer if we have more questions, but I have one more thing to add, which is that House Bill 2001 also included a provision that allowed for internal conversion of existing single family homes into middle housing. So that is a great option for just retaining the existing look of a neighborhood, if you can turn a single family house into a duplex. So that's a part that we don't talk about as much because it's all in the building code and we don't touch the building code. But another option, so we're hoping with by allowing detached plexes and those internal conversions, that we see a lot more backyard development or development where you can't even tell anything has happened at all. But there's new places for people to live.
And I'll just clarify that the conversions essentially, if you convert your house, you do get relaxations to the design standards that apply to things like triplexes and fourplexes and the like. But yeah, generally speaking, you'll really just be dealing with the building code at that point.
Sophie, if you wouldn't mind putting the link to the model code, I think that would be great. It's a good resource for bedtime reading. And I'll just add that your comments you're practicing in a sense for the city council. So that is great. I mean, one of the goals of the information sessions is to help people prepare to give their testimony and to learn about what they want to comment about. So I hope that I will take your comments as a sign that that's working. And again, we're not the decision makers, but this helps us understand what some of the concerns and comments are in the community. We are going to the city council next Wednesday for a work session to tell them what's coming. And then we'll be back after their spring break for the public hearing.
I don't see any other questions in the chat at this point. Other than a lot of links. Yeah, but we have a lot of links in the chat.
And if folks want a copy of the chat transcripts, please feel free to email me. I can send it to you. Or if you just want me to send you a bunch of new links in an email, I just love links.
Great, well, I think we might, if there's no further questions or comments.
All right, I will stop the recording. Well, thank you everyone for coming. And again, please reach out to staff if you have further questions, and please save the date for April 18th at 7:30. And please send your thoughts to middle housing testimony at eugene-or.gov.